My name is Savannah Serval, and for Case 2, I was assigned to cover reporting and relationships. So a little bit of background about the case. It takes place in an agricultural town with a population of just under 12,000 called Sunnyside. And in this case, Sunnyside Police Sergeant Phil Schneck asked Jessica Luce out on a date to a Halloween party in 1999. At the time, Luce was a general assignment reporter for the Yarmouth Herald-Republic, and she'd been there for about a year working in Sunnyside, Washington, and working her first job out of college. She and the police sergeant, Phil Schneck, spent time together during the 2 months following Halloween, and a time in which Luce would have qualified their relationship as strictly platonic. Now, during the time between Halloween and New Year's Day, when Luce and Schneck decided they were officially dating, Luce did write police stories for the Yarmouth Herald, but she never needed to use Schneck as a source. She kept their relationship, even when it was more platonic than romantic, quiet. Our newspaper did have a code of ethics which advised staff to avoid conflicts of interest and to disclose those that were unavoidable, and it prohibited gifts and travel. But it didn't specifically describe personal relationships that might have caused conflicts of interest. Now, Luce kept the relationship quiet because she felt it might be perceived as wrong, especially considering Schneck's boss ended up going through a lot of drama. He had been accused of shooting a great blue heron outside the police station, accused of storing explosives at the station house, and it was, I guess, kind of known that he had a threatening temper. So he resigned in November. One of Luce's coworkers throughout this whole time was dismayed that she was dating Schneck, saying it was cardinal rule number 1 to never ever date a source. Now, keep in mind that at this point, Schneck had never been one of Luce's sources. So Luce kind of rationalized the relationship with the fact that she and Schneck didn't even talk about work much. However, she couldn't avoid the potential conflict of interest any longer after Schneck in February was named acting captain and took control of the number 2 position in the Sunnyside Police Department. And when this happened, he also became the official media spokesperson, meaning that for the future, when Luce did stories, she would have to interview Schneck. So at this point, Luce knew she needed to be pulled off the police beat if she was going to continue her relationship with Schneck, and she went to her editors, who agreed. Now, her main editor, Craig Troianello, sat her down and asked her about the generalities of her relationship, thanking her for being proactive and making the ethical decision to come forward with this. And in their talk, he made it clear that he didn't want to question her integrity, but he had to kind of know what was going on and had been going on to make sure that he hadn't missed something that could be perceived as a potential conflict of interest, to make sure she hadn't reported in a way that led to Schneck's promotion, and just to ensure that his newspaper was above suspicion. As a small-town resident, Schneck seemed to think this was a little bit ridiculous. He questioned whether it's even realistic to have a strict conflict of interest policy in a small town. He was quoted as saying, "Everybody is a potential source, even the clerk at the grocery store. We eat food. If her husband or boyfriend is a farmer, you could say she's promoting eating. This is an idea that might be somewhat impractical. If you can't be a real person, how can you report on real people?" Now, Luce and Schneck were later engaged and received support from the community and city officials. Luce noted that what she and other journalists might perceive as an ethical problem isn't necessarily seen as an ethical problem by the public. However, there were a few city officials that did see this as an ethical problem, questioning whether Schneck leaked information about cases to Luce or to other reporters that she worked with, but in the textbook it just said that he explained that he did not. He was quoted as saying that he deals with stuff every day that Jessica would love to get her hands on, but we just don't talk about it. Now, this case leads to a few different issues that can be discussed. Issues fall under 3 different categories: micro, mid-range, and macro issues. So first we're going to address the micro issues. The first question is, did Luce have a responsibility to tell her editors about her relationship with Schneck? If so, when should Luce have informed them? I don't think she had a responsibility to tell her editors about her relationship with Schneck. She wasn't interviewing him or covering any cases he was involved in. There was no relationship between them, like between their personal relationship and the story she was covering. Those two didn't relate. So definitely when she wasn't using him, I don't think that it was necessary. Now later on when he became the official media spokesperson, then yes, I would say that that's necessary. And to answer the second part of the question, I would say that it would have been necessary for her to tell them when she did, which was when it became relevant to her work. The second question is, what responsibility did the Yarmouth Herald-Republic editors have to explain expectations on conflicts of interest? Is spelling out those expectations necessary or appropriate in a code of ethics? And I think the editors should have explained expectations on conflict of interest more clearly, especially regarding relationships. If the editors found it reason to be a possible ethical conflict when an employee, when a reporter began a relationship, or whether it be platonic or intimate, with any prominent city member, then I think that that should have been noted in the Code of Ethics. It would have been better just to make it clear and to have never needed it, or to make it clear and for the employees to know up front, than to have a problem later like they did because it wasn't specifically addressed. I just think this whole situation could have been avoided if there was a more specific code of ethics in place. The third question is, how would ethical questions have changed if Schneck worked in another capacity for the city, such as being a teacher? And I don't even think there would have been an ethical question here if Schneck worked as a teacher. I mean, it would have changed if he were the mayor and Luce were covering his re-election campaign or something of the sort, but especially as a teacher, I don't think there would have been any question. Teachers and police officers, or not teachers and police officers, teachers and reporters fall in love quite often, I imagine. I know a couple that's a teacher, and one works at our local newspaper, and there's never been any question about it that I've heard. So the last question in the micro issues is how would the ethical questions have changed if Luce and Schneck had remained only friends? Now, I think there would have been less concern had they remained only friends, but there still would have been room to question whether Schneck were leaking information to Luce, or if Luce were reporting in a way that painted him in an especially positive light to the paper, like that led to his promotion. So it still would have existed there, I think. The next set of questions falls under the mid-range issues category. The first one is, what aspects of their lives should journalists be able to keep private? This one is a hard one, and I kind of go back and forth on it all the time, but I think that I more often think that journalists should be able to keep as much of their lives private as they want. Part of being a journalist involves having to respect the privacy of others, and so I think the same respect for privacy should be applied and provided for journalists. I don't see why a journalist should have to reveal any more details of their personal relationships than a doctor or a teacher. Now, I understand having to notify your editor when you're in a relationship with a source, but other than that, I don't think that journalists should have to sacrifice any of their privacy. Second question is public perception of an ethical problem truly relevant? And I think it is somewhat relevant. On one hand, an ethical problem shouldn't be resolved based solely on what the public thinks. I think that it should be handled in a way that does good, is honest and fair, solves the problem at hand, and works best for all parties involved. But there's a little bit of an exception in the case of a newspaper, because they have a relationship to uphold with its readership, and its existence depend on its readership being able to count on them and be faithful in them and trusting them. So I think that in that case, public perception matters slightly. It's important to keep your readers in mind at all times, even when dealing with something that won't directly be announced to them. The third question is, journalists spend most of their times with two groups, their sources and their coworkers. Considering those limitations, is dating possible or advisable? I'm not really sure where exactly I fall on this, I would say that dating is definitely possible and probably advisable. I am such a people person that I would never advise anyone to be alone if they didn't want to be. I wouldn't recommend dating a coworker, but then when I start to say that I would recommend dating a source over a coworker, that doesn't sound so great either. But I don't think it's right to say that it's not possible or advisable, because you can't tell someone to date or say that someone shouldn't date just because of their profession. I think it's important for journalists to use discretion when dating and to be honest and upfront about any relationships that may lead to possible conflicts of interest. But I would say journalists, keep on dating for sure, because I would if I were you. The last question in the mid-range issues is talking about how Maria Shriver recently took a leave of absence as her husband, Arnold Schwarzenegger, ran a successful race for governor of California. The question is, as she returns to her duties, what limitations, if any, should be imposed on her reporting? It would be pretty obvious, I think, if Shriver started reporting in a way that was above and beyond what was necessary in covering Schwarzenegger and anything about his race or what he's doing or really just anything that involves him at all. If I were her boss, I would just go ahead and take her off of it altogether. It would eliminate any possible doubt viewers had about what the motives of the station are, where our loyalties lie, if we're biased, any possible doubt that viewers might have about her and about her motives specifically. I just wouldn't want my viewers to question if she was telling the truth just because of her relationship with Schwarzenegger. So I would say that as far as limitations for her go, just don't even cover Schwarzenegger unless she was doing so with another reporter or with a group of reporters. The last two questions fall under the macro issues category. The first one is, can journalists cover communities effectively if they are expected to remain remote and removed? I don't think a journalist can be expected to cover communities effectively if they're expected to remain remote and removed. I don't think you can cover a community you don't know. Knowing a community means you know what's going on, you know when things change, you know when things happen, you know what matters to a community, you know when stories are worth telling, you know what the people want to know, what they want to hear. So to cover a community, I would say that you have to be a part of a community. And the best way to be a part of a community is to form relationships with people. So, I mean, the more you know, the more you have to tell. And the last question is, how specific should code of ethics be on conflicts of interest? And I think they should be as specific as possible in regards to conflicts of interest and in every other area as well. As I said before, it's way better to be more specific upfront and just to tackle it right from the beginning than to leave it vague and have questionable relationships or reporting practices or any cause for concern later on. It's like you've got the opposing team wide receiver, and you're not just going to leave him open until he gets close to the end zone and it becomes a problem. You're going to tackle him as soon as he gets his hands on the ball, just to go ahead and take the problem, which for your team would be him scoring, out of the equation. So I think that Schneck's quote really sums up this case well. He says, if you can't be a real person, how can you report on real people? Thanks for listening.